And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today, I want to talk about some some alternative theories about the origins of Christianity. And a lot of times, when we talk about these alternative theories, like mythicism or Roman provenance, for example, people just write it off immediately as pseudo scholarship. It's all fringe. This isn't real. Nobody's talking about this. This is a joke. But on the topic of Roman provenance, I think we should give it a fair shake. There's two reasons why. Number one, Alexandria, Egypt. After the Ptolemies, when Roman takes over, Alexandria, Egypt is just a haven for religious thinking and ideas and synchronism and transferring of different rites and stuff like that. And, you have Eusebius saying that, Mark and Peter wrote the first gospel in Alexandria. So if there was a place that something like this could have happened, it'd be here. The second reason, in my opinion, the Sibylline books, the central text of the Roman religion, the Sibylline books. When you follow the trajectory of these books, they start off pagan, and then they become incorporated by Hellenist Jews in Alexandria. And then, all of a sudden, the Sibylline books are Christian, and that's it. And they're not even pagan anymore. And all the way up until the 15th century, the Sibylline oracles are purely Christian text. No one else is doing this but Christians. You even have texts about Muhammad being the Baphomet, Sibylline oracles in the 9th century, I think it was. And so I think there might be something to this. Now, there's a lot of things about Roman provenance that I'm critical of. The whole Vespasian thing, you lost me on that one. But with all that being said, I have a credible guest, in my opinion, one of my good friends, Jacob Berman from History Valley. Jacob, how are you doing today? Everyone go and subscribe to History Valley. I really enjoy your channel, and I think everybody you're on fire right now. You've been having on amazing guests, doing amazing topics. Go and subscribe to History Valley right now and come back. Links in the description. With that being said, what's going on, Jacob? And based on what I was talking about, take it away, man. How are you today, and where are you at with all this stuff? Because this is kind of something that you've been really looking into for the past couple years.
Hmm. Well, thanks for having me, Neil. I've been doing a lot of research into Paul, and I've been interviewing several scholars, and I plan on interviewing several more on Paul, what he believed, and when he wrote his letters and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I've come to return to my original position that I used to hold a while ago. That I think there's a good piece of evidence that Paul wrote earlier, and it really centers around the Aretas passage in Second Corinthians, when Paul says he fled from Damascus because he was fleeing from King Aretas of Nebatea. And Josephus also mentions that King Aretas, about the same time that Paul was fleeing from him, uh, he's going after the Herods, which I found that to be curious. There's not many scholars, but there's a couple of scholars that look at what Paul says in Romans 16, and they see that he's a kinsman to a Herodian figure. Now, some might say there's not really much there. Herodian, so what? Well, Herodian is a name outside of the Herodian family, but you have to think about it. He's fleeing from Aretas at the same time. And that's when I began to ask the question, is that really a coincidence? And I personally, at this time, don't think that it is. Paul doesn't really provide a reason why Regis is going after him at all. But if it's true that he's a Herodian relative, well, I think that's a good reason right there, because Aretas was pretty pissed off at the Herods in 37 CE. We got to remember, Herod Antipas divorced Phasaelus, Aretas' daughter, That's because Antipas wanted to marry his own niece, Herodias. So Aretas took an insult to that. He was quite angry, as Josephus tells us, and wanted to enact vengeance upon Herod Antipas and his family.
Interesting.
And when he attacked Jerusalem in 37, Josephus tells us that the Jewish population thought that, well, I guess that was payback for beheading John the Baptist.
Now, so
Yeah.
you're looking at the text, and
Mhm.
you're seeing that there's little nuggets of historical truth that
Yeah.
tell us something about what the writer is saying about the time, about the movement.
Mhm.
Herodians, the king Aretas up in Syria. Um, so
Mhm.
yeah, that's interesting. I think there's something to that. Now, you mentioned earlier, because a lot of people might not know this. You used to think that the dating of Paul's letters are way off, and you thought they were way later. And
Mhm.
some of the things that you pointed to was a reference to the wrath of God being poured out.
Yeah.
So you think he's talking about the temple. So you recently changed your mind on that, and now you're saying no, that's earlier. I'm going back to what I thought before. Tell us about that.
Yeah. There's this really interesting book called Heirs of the Reunited Church by Bartosz Adamczewski, and that recently got me thinking about the um, of 40 CE dating of Paul that I've looked into before, and I've interviewed him several times on my channel. I don't think I released the one I did with him on this specific book yet. Um, I plan on to probably today, actually, or in a few days. Um, I think that, as some people will say, there's not much references to like that places Paul chronologically in any specific decade in the first century, and it's like it's very hard to date his letters. But I think the Aretus passage is very important, even if it's just one brief mention of Aretus. I think that's key to understanding when Paul wrote. Now, I think, in a sense, canonical Paul, meaning the final version of Paul's letters, as they are, were put together and collected after 70. And there are scholars that think that there were insertions into the text.
Well, that's what I was saying is people don't think about this as much as I
Mhm.
think they should. Is that when we have a text that's dated to a certain time, to Corinthians, I don't know. Let's just take
Yeah,
Corinthians. Most people, I do this too. We just assume that whenever this letter was written, it was exactly how it is, and the Greek that we have today is exactly how Paul wrote it. But we
right,
don't think about that Paul could have written something very similar to what we have, but there could be interpolations and
sure,
redactions and changes being made decades later that we'll never know. We won't even know if it ever happened unless we found a manuscript, but we don't have any Paul manuscripts in the first century. So there's no way we would ever know if Paul's letter is exactly what he wrote. We have no
yeah,
way of knowing that. So there's just some things that we're just in the dark about. In Paul's letters, for all we know, that most of the big chunks of this text could be dated early on, like in the 50s or whatever, 40s. Sometimes people say 50s, maybe 60s. I'm saying 50s, 60s. I'm not. Some people say 40s, but I'm saying a little later than that. But we don't
yeah,
even know which parts. There could be parts of these texts that somebody changed, some scribe changed in the 70s or 90s or something. Because we have no idea because we don't have any other manuscripts that are
right,
before the third century, basically. Like that's like the oldest manuscripts we got, basically third century and later. So
yeah,
how do we know that there wasn't some earlier version of these texts that are changed? We just don't know. We're just left in the dark about that stuff. I just wanted to point that out for people to think about. These texts that we have, how do we even really know this is what really was penned down to begin with? And I know there's a lot of people who say, well, we know from textual criticism. Bart Ehrman's a textual critic.
yeah,
Even Bart Ehrman's is one of the people who will tell you there's no way of knowing if the text is exactly the same as it was, from the time that we date it to, not the time that we have the oldest manuscripts of, but the times that we date the text to. There's no way
Right.
of knowing. Even Bart will say that. I've heard him say that before. So even your
Mhm.
big textual critics who will point out these things that, oh yeah, the manuscripts are very close together. There's barely any differences, but those are all within a certain time period, 3rd century. So we don't know what's before that. Period.
Correct. And Paul makes interesting statements. I forget if it's in First or Second Corinthians about the temple is subject to the flames, and he could have said that because he's looking back at what happened to the original temple that was destroyed. Says, okay, well, if it's destroyed before, it can be again. If one takes a position that he's referring to the destruction of the temple in 70, that could be an insertion. Very easily. There are many scholars that already believe that there is an insertion in, I think
Interesting.
it's in First Corinthians about when Paul makes a statement about women can speak in church. And scholars will point out that, oh, that's very similar to a statement. I think it's in First Timothy, which it makes it very similar statement about Paul being a misogynist and saying that women can't speak in church. And I think some will look at that and say, somebody looked at the pastorals and shoved that into First Corinthians and try to harmonize the text, maybe. But others will say it was already there in First Corinthians, and Paul was simply referring to maybe his opponents that think that, and he's not really talking about himself. And that would also presuppose that the pastorals are inauthentic. Um, Yeah, Pauline scholarship is, in a sense, complicated,
Yeah.
and you've got scholars.
Well, I just want to point this out real
Yeah.
quick because, and I don't mean to cut you off, but
Mhm.
this is something that it's like it's the elephant in the room thing right here. We have all these texts that are ascribed to Paul.
Yeah.
Only 7 of them we all agree on are written by one guy with the same writing style, the same tendencies.
Mhm.
But no one really like. We're gonna okay. Let's agree to say a guy named Paul wrote that. Fine, I don't have a problem with that. But all we know is that one person wrote those 7 letters, and the other ones are also ascribed to this same guy. So there's
Yeah.
already some fuckery going on here.
Mhm.
That's a big elephant in the room right there. We're all admitting that there's some fuckery happening. Excuse my language, but
Mm,
there's some
yeah.
shit going on here. We're all agreed on that, and we just act like it's not a big deal. We just act like who cares? But like we're all admitting that most of these texts, well, I shouldn't say most, good chunk of these epistles aren't even
Mhm.
written by this guy. Only 7 of them line up with one author. And who knows if even and now this is I'm not going to say this is the case, but like there's a slim chance that those 7 texts are written by some other guy named who just said he's Paul. How do you know? We don't know that. And I just want to remind people that we don't know for sure if a guy named Paul that we all think is Paul from the book of this hero from the book of Acts who went on this big journey and taught all these different churches, all these things. We don't know if he really wrote these letters. We know that
Yeah.
one person wrote 7 letters. That's what we know. That's what textual criticism tells us. One
Right.
person wrote 7 of these letters, and all the other ones, the other 5 or 6 or whatever, someone else wrote those. So so one thing we know for sure is that there are some people messing with text and ascribing these letters to people who aren't them. That's the only thing we can say for sure. Everything else is all theory.
Some might say that that maybe over time, Paul was, changing his, the way he wrote. But there's an interesting statement in Galatians that I want everybody to think about. Paul states, "I'm all things to all men. To those that are under the law, I'm under the law. To those that are not under the law, I'm not under the law." That's a very interesting statement because what he's saying is he's like, I'm going to pretend to agree with these people and agree with these people and agree with these people over there, even if their viewpoints clash with one another. Because that's basically what he's saying in Galatians. And if one wants to take the position that Paul wrote all the text attributed to him, then it would fit in line with what he said in Galatians, that he's all things to all men. Just wanted to point that out.
I like that point because
Mhm.
you're bringing the personality of Paul back to Paul through the text, and that's a you got to and that's very fair to the Christians, first of all, but it's also interesting because you had this character Paul who's saying you got to play around with these people a little bit. They got to tell them what they want to hear. You got to
Right.
tell the Jews that you like the law and you love all this. You're not going to eat pork. You're going to do all this stuff. Then you got to tell the Gentiles that sometimes it's cool to do this and sometimes it's cool. Paul's a marketer. He's a PhD in marketing guy. Like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, he's so that I'm glad you brought that up because those things do remind me that the person that wrote these texts, there is some sort of authentic, flawed personality behind it. It's not
Right.
just like a
Yeah.
Platonic epistle. Like, how Plato writes these epistles, they're all fake. There's just some guy writing a letter and it's just it's philosophy baked into the text.
Mhm.
Not a real, but you just made a good point where I'll give it to the Christians. These texts kind of do seem authentic because there's some flaw. There's some. There's, it, he's flawed in some ways. There's some things that you can point to and say, Paul seems a little bit angry about this, or Paul seems a little weird
Yeah.
about this. So there is some authenticity there. And you know me, I'm always fair about shit like this. And yeah,
Right.
good point.
Yeah, and Paul mentions in First Corinthians he's come across different leaders that were, I think he was saying apostles in Christ before him, like Cephas, Apollos, and I think John, and he's frustrated because you've got people over there that believe in Apollos, you got people that believe in Cephas or Christ, and that's interesting. So he's mentioning that there's a group of people that believe in Christ without believing in him, and therefore not believing in Cephas and Apollos either, because he's distinguishing the different sects in the sectarians in First Corinthians, chapter 1, actually. It's right at the beginning of the chapter. Massive division
It
among
makes you wonder because we know Paul's Christianity is because that's the Christianity that survives. But this
yeah,
Apollos character, what I wonder, it makes you wonder, what was this guy teaching? What kind of Jesus did he want you to believe in?
right.
Because that's
Yeah,
the thing about these Christianities. People call them Gnostics. People call them heretics. They're all Christianities. They all have a different Jesus that they want you to believe in.
right.
They apply a certain mythos to Jesus of Nazareth that they think that he would want you to be. This is how the Jesus of Nazareth would have wanted you to live like. This is what he would have said. They all
Mhm.
have that. They're all using that as their main weapon to get across their whatever they're getting. You make like, who is this Apollos guy? What was he talking about? What kind of Jesus did he believe in? You know?
Right. And at this time, just let's take a dive into Acts.
Sure.
What I have a problem with Acts is several scholars have noted Acts and Paul contradict each other many times. Acts, like Peter and Paul are getting along, and Galatians they hate each other. I'm like, okay, that's a problem. And Galatians, uh, excuse me, Acts. In Acts, Paul's vision uh, is happening in Damascus, but Paul never says that. And what's interesting is that in Acts, Paul gets rescued on a Paul saves himself by getting lowered on a basket
It
from some building.
just doesn't sound like a realistic story.
Right, but
Yeah.
it's happening, but the problem is he's running away uh from the Jews in Acts, whereas in Second Corinthians he's running away from Aretas. It's the same story, but in Acts it's somebody else he's running away from, another group of people he's running away from, instead of Aretas and his army. So it's like, okay, that's odd. I very much doubt he did the same thing twice, possibly a decade or decades apart. No.
It makes you wonder if these are two different narratives. Like sort of like two different like it's the same story, but like told two different ways, and then Axe is trying to put them together. That's what it seems like, and that happens a lot in the Bible too. Like in the Old
Yeah,
Testament, especially the Old Testament, you'll see the same. It's like you're reading the same stories over and over. You're like, why does this story sound so familiar to the last story I just read in the last chapter?
sure. Yeah.
And it's because of this documentary hypothesis that people talk about, where
Hmm.
you have the Yahweh source, the Elohist source, the priestly source, the Deuteronomy source, and these are all 4 different Bible texts that were floating around independently, and then
Right.
at some point, the priests in Jerusalem, I'm guessing, said, all these floating texts that are floating around, they kind of contradict each other. We got to make these coincide. We got to make one story and then stick with it forever. So they stitched it together.
Right.
And that's kind of how some of these stories in the New Testament kind of come off as well. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a
I
super
think.
chat. Oh, go ahead.
Um,
Finish your thought. I'll read it in a second.
no, that's fine. Go ahead and read it.
Ted Francis, thank you for the super chat. What happened to Paul and how did he die and when? What do you think, James? Yeah, what do you think? Jacob, sorry.
I think Bartos is right that Paul's death most likely occurred by 49, because he's got Paul in Rome by 49 CE, that's about the time that the expulsion of the
And
Jews from
you
Rome
take
took place.
before Nero.
Yes.
Interesting. And so let me ask you this, because I'm not going to say that what you're saying is impossible, because the idea that Paul would be killed by Nero is more inviting to the Christian ear. Nero is the 666, the Antichrist, the beast. Of course, Paul would get killed by Nero. That sounds like something more made up than what you're saying is, what is it? Claudius? Is that who it is? Claudius?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
It.
not, but you're saying Claudius had nothing to do with Paul. He's just some unheard of. The Roman emperor's not dealing with guys like Paul. This has nothing. All these stories that Peter went up to Nero and said, I have them
No,
here.
I think that's a
That's
myth.
all myth, right?
When you read
When
the
Paul got
story,
killed, it probably was just
you know,
locally happening somewhere. The emperor probably didn't even know about
mhm.
it. That's how different worlds these people are living in. So go ahead, finish your thought.
And in the late second century, if I remember correctly, Lucius Chorinus wrote the original story. There might have been someone else slightly earlier, but I don't recall. There's a but anyway, around his time, we get the myth of Paul's death under Nero. So this is around 200 CE or just before it. So about the beginning of the 3rd century CE, and it's ridiculous. You got Paul going to Rome. He gets beheaded like John the Baptist. And then his head gets reattached to his throat and he rises from the dead. And that sounds like nonsense from start to finish. I'm like,
Really?
come
I didn't think it
on.
sounded like. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, I'm like, I don't think there's anything we can get out of that as historical. Not for a second. It just sounds, no matter if you think Paul wrote in a different era, I don't think I ever bought into the Neronian thing. It just sounded ridiculous to me. It still sounds ridiculous to me. I just I just have a hard time believing it.
Yeah, because I mean, later on, when we're talking about Christians legend making these legends of their early Christian forefathers who came about and that wrote these first epistles of how the church should be run.
Right.
Of course, they're going to make him legendary, and of course, Paul meets Nero. Nero is the most important character in the world. He's the Roman emperor. He's the blood of Augustus. No, he's not the blood, but he's adopted. He's adopted in the Julio Claudian family.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean. They didn't see a difference between blood and adoption. They didn't care. He's the Julio Claudian emperor. He's the king of the world.
Yeah.
So for Paul to go square off with Nero, that is a good story. That's a story that is going to be impressive, and it's also going to capture the hearts and minds of all the people who aren't like living as nobles as the plebs. Because
Yeah.
Christianity is what makes Christianity thrive is that it's for the plebs, it's for the common people, it's for everyone. It's not just for these rich initiated
Yeah, there
nobles,
you go.
patrician
Yeah.
families. It's for the plebs. And so when they hear a story about this guy Paul going up against Nero and dying for his religion as a martyr, that's something people want to hear. That's a powerful
Absolutely.
story. But
Yeah.
did it really happen? Is it likely that it happened that way? No.
No.
It's just not realistic that this Roman emperor who's dealing with the affairs of the state is just going to stop doing what he's doing to deal with some random religious guy from the eastern coast of the empire. Not going to happen. Period.
Mm.
And by the way, the idea that Paul, because he had Roman citizenship, was able to appeal to Caesar, and then they took a boat and this Roman citizen, he appealed to Caesar. Everybody get the boat ready. Let's ship him all the way to Rome. Let's spend all our resources on this random guy. Just didn't happen. It's such a bullshit narrative.
No.
It really is. Like, it just didn't happen. People don't just say, I appeal to Caesar. Take me to Caesar now. No. Really? How about I'll take you to Hades right now. Slice. Like, they're not
Right.
going to waste their time on you. It's just not. It just doesn't work that way. The logistics of it doesn't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
Some random guy says, I'm a Roman citizen and I appeal to Caesar. Take me to Caesar right now. I command it. Who are you? No,
Yeah.
we're not doing shit for you, dude. In fact, you're getting put on the cross now. Goodbye. That's what's going to happen.
Right.
So that's, obviously I'm speculating, but I'm just looking at the likelihood of these things. That's what I'm weighing
Yeah, I get it.
the odds
Yeah.
here. What really happened? Let's be real about this story,
Yeah, I think I think Paul had his vision in the 30s, and I think after the crucifixion of Jesus is when this vision took place. I guess when exactly he did is probably debatable, but I think what's going on is that you have this deep Hellenization of Jesus's movement that's going on after the crucifixion. It's like when Jesus was crucified, he no longer had control of the movement. It just spiraled out of control with Paul coming in there and with his Herodian connections that I think are there. It becomes a giant mess, and that's when Hellenism starts creeping into the movement, in my view.
Yeah, it makes sense. I can totally see
Yeah.
that being the case. Paul
Mhm.
keep playing. Thanks for the super chat. Valiant makes the mistake of thinking a Torah Orthodox prophet would be a Mosaic warlord. Simon Magus usurped Dosithios because he was attacked physically by him, and his followers were turned off. Next, okay, he's got another.
Mhm.
Oh, you didn't have the super chat again. You could just typed it out, man. Would have found it. Let me see. Where is it? Where is it? There it is. And Samaritans only adhered to the Torah. With Jesus, they were disciples of John the Baptizer.
Hmm.
This was strictly a non-violent Jewish sect. Next super chat. No, you don't have to do that. Just type it out, man. Type it out. But I appreciate that. I really appreciate the super chat. This is an interesting topic. What do you think about that? Do you remember do you want to touch on this?
Let me see.
First one says, Valiant makes the mistake of thinking the Torah Orthodox
Um,
prophet would be a Mosaic warlord.
yeah, that depends on how much of Simon Magus' story you think is real. Because that what we get the Josephus
Good point.
situation from the Clementine writings. Um, I to, but to speak on John the Baptist, I tend to think that John the Baptist and and the followers of Jesus were connected. Some think that they're not, but as far as I know, the majority of scholars believe that John the Baptist did baptize Jesus. I'm inclined to agree with that. And I think John Dominic Crossan is right that John the Baptist died before Jesus. There are scholars that think he died after because Josephus thinks that John the Baptist dies later. been Jesus. But John Dominic Crossan points out,
Oh, it's because that in the sequence of events that
correct,
Josephus lays out, it's the John the Baptist's death is mentioned later. But I will point this out as an avid reader of Josephus. Someone
right?
I can say this. I'm not an expert. I'm not Steve Mason, but I can say this with confidence from how much I've read Josephus. He's not putting everything in order. He's jumping around.
Oh yeah,
He might,
precisely.
because here's the thing about Josephus. If he's talking about Pontius Pilate, which he does in chapter 13, book 13 or 18. I'm sorry, book 18. When he's
Yeah,
talking about Pontius Pilate, he's going to stay on the topic of Pontius Pilate, even if it means he's going to go a couple decades into the future and then go back to where he was. That's what he
there you go.
does in book 18. So the fact that
Yeah,
John the Baptist happens later in the narrative doesn't mean it happened later. It just means he tells it later.
yeah,
So that's what I would say.
yeah. I agree. I think that finishes that point pretty nicely.
Yeah. Also with the Torah Orthodox prophet, honestly, it could go either way because
Mhm.
Valiant's not wrong to
Right.
point out that if there was a prophet, he most likely would have been someone with fundamentalist ideas, following Moses, following the Torah, and
Yeah.
people want to look for a prophet that's doing that because that's what the type of people who look for a prophet or a Messiah are usually fundamentalist types to begin with. Let's be real,
Yeah.
but
I tend to.
but it's not impossible.
Mm,
As to Paul's point, it's not impossible that there could be a Messiah or someone with a messianic attitude who people are looking up to, who's very charismatic, who might have some Hillel the Elder type vibes going. Hillel the Elder said, "Love
right.
your neighbor
Yeah.
like yourself."
Yeah.
So it's not, and we have evidence of that. The question is, what kind of person is Jesus? We just don't know. We just don't know what he was. Like we can look at Simon of Perea. We can look at Judas of Galilee. We can look at all these other people, and he probably was like one of those guys. He probably was a normal guy.
Yeah. I subscribe to the Brandon Eisenman idea that the SGF Brandon Robert Eisenman idea that Jesus was a zealot. That's what I think. He was a Torah Orthodox zealot.
Could be.
You know?
I mean, Steve Mason is obviously he's a bona fide expert in this stuff. He's a
Oh
historian.
yeah.
He's a historian first, and he's a Josephus expert also. He kind of points out that the word zealot in our minds today is sort of been warped over time.
Hmm.
That sometimes a zealot is not just a fundamentalist warlord. It could be that. Obviously, Josephus has this story about the zealots that were at Masada and they were murdering people and going crazy and doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there could be. I guess it could be that. But as far as Jesus goes, and then you do have in the Gospels, you do have the authors of Matthew and Mark and Luke going out of their way to tell you that his followers were zealots. Some
Oh
of
yeah.
not all of them, but some of them.
Like there's a statement that somewhere that James was zealous for the law. Yeah. And I think that's, in my view, that's important evidence of even the historical Jesus having been a zealot himself. Because that's not something that a Christian would like to invent later and put it back. Like, you don't want, they're not going to want to do that. They want to promote Jesus as a peaceful Hellenist, not this.
Yeah. What was I going to say? So, do you think that James's movement that because we hear all the time that James led this church in Jerusalem. I don't outside of a couple of texts that we have, we don't know much about it. We don't know when it starts, when it ends. We just know that there was a church in Jerusalem and James was the leader, and that Paul had his church and John might have had another church somewhere else, and Peter, or whatever, who knows. But when you talk about James in particular, a lot of times I want to tie him to the Ebionites, where these are Torah observant Christians following the Old Testament. Would you think that too?
Yeah, I do, and that would kind of lead up to the Dead Sea Scroll stuff because I think that Jesus's movement likely were familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls because we got to remember there was even Dead Sea Scrolls found at Masada. The Jewish rebels during the Jewish War even knew about these scrolls. So I think it's a safe bet that before 70, before 66 CE, before the war, it's the same thing, obviously. And I think Jesus' movement were following both the Old Testament and the teachings of the scrolls. Now, I want to say one more thing. I want to caption one thing here. Just because I agree with Eisenman that Jesus was a zealot, that doesn't mean I agree with him about his view of the Dead Sea Scrolls being largely, if not entirely, first century text. I don't buy that Pesher Habakkuk was mentioning Paul in some coded way, and that James is in there too as a righteous teacher. I reject that argument. I think his claims that the New Testament made use of the Dead Sea Scrolls is true. Many scholars have noted that, like James Charlesworth and many others. Like there are the idea that there's a lot of parallels between the teachings of the New Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls are there. That doesn't mean though that the New Testament borrowed directly from the scrolls, because scholars will also point out, and I think Charlesworth points this out too, that there could be other traditions connected to the scrolls that that we don't have now, that the New Testament could have borrowed from instead, and not directly from the scrolls. So that's something else to remember. Remember, we don't have everything. There's a lot of stuff we lost.
Yeah, and then especially when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of these texts are ranging from first century BCE
Oh yeah,
through, and that's a long time.
I
Like
think second
to
century
put this
BC
in
some of it
perspective,
too.
yeah, put this in perspective for people. We think of, okay, they were first century BC slash AD. Yeah, it was the same time period. Whoa, 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 same time period.
Okay,
That's
that's
two
ridiculous.
centuries. That's like, imagine if I had a library full of books from the 1900s and the 2000s. Now think of how many different think of how different the world is from now and 1950.
Oh yeah,
Like just like, so think about that. When we think about all these texts we find at the Dead Sea location of Qumran that are ranging from different dates, they're they're from different time periods. Different people wrote them and copied them. It's not the same. You know what I mean? In any way, shape, or form. They're not from the same time. They're from different times. You know,
right.
just wanted to point that out there.
Yeah.
Let's see what's next. Thank you for the super chats, everybody.
Hmm.
Chat GPT says, please discuss secret of Mark slash carpocrations.
Oh, I think I don't buy the idea that Secret Mark was faked by Morton Smith. I think um, that it's a second century text that probably is some kind of redaction based on canonical mark.
Interesting.
But other than that, I think it's a theological mess, and all it does is it provides us a viewpoint of a particular sect of Christians. But that's it. There are some people out there that take it way too far and say, "Oh, it reveals things about the historical Jesus." I'm no. I rejected that argument from day one.
Yeah.
That's just ridiculous in my mind. To my mind.
Well, if it's authentic, it does tell us about the way gospels are written like in general, and how gospels,
Yeah.
any gospel is not the historical, they're legends. The author of that text is saying that these are just legends to get people to believe. And like
Yeah.
that's like Clement of Alexandria is like not cool with that at all. Like, what do you mean? No, don't say that.
Yeah.
Don't say
Yeah.
that. Please don't say that. Like, they don't like that at all. But it's true, obviously. We know that. We know it's drawn.
Right.
We know it's drawn from the Old Testament. We know that all these tropes of carrying the cross and getting sold for 30 shekels, and that's all tropes drawing from the Old Testament. And not only are they drawing from the Old Testament, they're drawing tropes from the Old Testament and putting them on a Jesus, but they're also drawing tropes from other myths, the Orphic mysteries, the Dionysus mysteries, other things in the ancient world, and they're putting it on a Jesus as well. He's becoming this super duper important savior figure, better than all the other savior figures before him.
Right.
That's just what it is. That's what's happening that's what's happening with the Gospels. That's
Right.
what makes me, and this brings it back to the beginning of this video when I mentioned Alexandria, Egypt. That's what makes me think that some of this stuff was written in Alexandria, Egypt, because I've recently learned this when I went to Egypt. I was told that during the Roman Empire, when they had control of Egypt, like when they took over the Ptolemaic Empire,
Yeah.
when any boat pulled up into the harbor of Alexandria,
Yeah.
they were immediately searched, and any books or any papyri that they had were confiscated, copied, and then given back. Didn't matter what it was. It could be your lunch. It could be what I want to eat for lunch. Doesn't matter what it is. They took it and they copied it. That was the rule of Alexandria. If you come to Alexandria and you have a text, they're going to take it from you. They're going to copy it so they can have a copy for their library. That's how the Library of Alexandria got so advanced. They had everything. They had a text for everything. Christianity, if a text like Christianity that's so advanced, it's drawing from so many places, the only way to write something like that is to be where all the without the internet, you can't write that.
Yeah.
You do it in a library like Alexandria. It makes perfect sense that it was written somewhere like Alexandria, maybe Pergamum.
As a matter of fact, in the Mar Sarabon letter, the Mar Saba letter, excuse me, Mar Saba, there is a letter by Mar Bar Sarabon with a different situation, a letter of Mar Bar Sarabon. But I'm talking about the Masaba letter, which is claiming. See, this is a text that people think Morton Smith. Some people think Morton Smith made all that crap up, and that's nonsense. But this text mentions that secret mark was written in Alexandria.
Yeah, that makes sense. And by the way,
Yeah.
people hate on Morton Smith. I don't know why. They're like the way they
It's
talk
because
about his book, Jesus the Magician, like he was some blasphemy. It's a good book.
it's because it's
a damn
claimed.
good book.
Yeah, it's because
he's going hard. He's not holding back. And all these seminaries in America that sort of influence how academia is done don't like that shit.
yeah,
Let's just be real right now.
Morton.
I'm in the mood to be real right now. That's the shit that people have to deal with. Morton Smith didn't care. Jesus was a magician. Look, he's holding a wand. Morton Smith was way ahead of me, man. Morton Smith, I like Morton Smith. People talk a lot of shit about Morton Smith. I don't know why. I think he was a great scholar.
Morton. It's because there's a claim that went around that Morton was a homosexual.
I'm
That he
not surprised.
faked.
I'm not surprised.
Right, and he faked this text to make Jesus to be a homosexual like him. That's basically the claim. But as a scholar that I've had on, Dr. James David Aldlin points out, Morton had a girlfriend. You know,
I don't even care if that's the case. I don't even care about that at all. I think
I don't either. But my
scholarship
point is, he's responding against the homophobes
I get what
that
you're
are
saying.
attacking him.
I get what you're saying. The people are
Yeah.
trying to take his credibility away.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Based on nonsensical crap.
Right. But that's the thing. You're dealing with somebody who's a really good scholar, who's putting
Right.
amazing information. People just don't like it.
Even if he was homosexual, who cares?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
And he actually made, as Odlin points out, and that there was a mistake in the Greek in the translation that Morton Smith did. He made a mistake when translating it, at least in one place. How can you make a mistake in your own work that you're faking in the first place? That's what he points out. Morton screwed up in one place in the Greek. That's all he's saying.
Oh, interesting. Well, I have to look into that some more. But as far as I know, I think he was a good scholar. But obviously,
I agree.
Know everything. I could be wrong. Someone could prove me wrong. Let me know. The second part before we get to the next super chat was the carpocrations. Carpocrations. This is a really good book about the Carpocrations from M. David Litwell.
Yes.
Carpocrates. What I can say about them before we move on to the next super chat real quick, because there's a couple more. They were a true communistic society living in Egypt, Christian to the core. They
Mhm.
read the Bible, they read the text. I think John was their favorite text. I can't remember which one it was. It's in here. But the book of Acts in chapter 4 and 5 talks about that when you join a Christian community, you're supposed to sell your property, sell your business, sell your house, sell everything, and go and return to the feet of the apostles and give them everything you have. And then once you've done that, you can join the community. That's how the Carpocratians were actually living. They were living up to the text. They were living that. They were real. They weren't just saying they were Christians and then voting for Trump to get them better lower taxes so they can have more money and run a business. Like, no, these were real Christians living poverty lifestyle. Like, you kind of have to respect that a little bit. Like, they were really doing it. They were really trying to be Christians. You don't see that
Yeah.
anymore. But that's all I could say about them right now. No, and it was in Egypt too, by the way, Egypt. So thanks for that super chat.
Yeah, I love Dr. Litwell's books.
Yeah, Lit was great.
Yeah.
Paul Kickling, thanks for the super chat. How we know Hellenic Judaism existed through Philo. Jesus comes from the most Hellenized part of Israel. Not a bad point. Jesus had to abide to Plato just as much as the Torah. I'll explain in the chat. Oh, I skipped a super chat. I'm so sorry. Paul, I'll get right back to this, but this is a huge super chat.
Mm.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Yellow Slike, for the super chat. I almost skipped it too. Can you imagine that? Thank you so much. Thoughts on Vespasian or Augustus as the Christ archetype? Especially want to hear Jacob. Fair enough.
Oh yeah, I think this is easy. There's a lot of parallels between the way the Christians look at Jesus and the way that the Romans looked at Augustus when he was deified, and and also to an extent Vespasian. Jesus and Vespasian both supposedly did the miracle of spitting on the eye to heal the blind, and Augustus has this whole thing of ascending to heaven like Jesus does, and he becomes a god. Just as Jesus rises up into heaven, he's going to come back one day. And there's a lot more to it than that. But I think what the Christians were trying to do is they were trying to make Jesus better than these people we just mentioned. Yeah, he's going to imitate their miracles, but he's going to do more.
Yeah, no, I this is such a good point. The Tacitus Pope talks about this.
Yeah.
How Vespasian was in the temple of Serapis, and somebody came up to him and they wanted to be healed by his eyes. He spits in his
Yeah.
eyes, heals him. Another person walks up, he's got a maimed hand. He touches the hand grows back. This is Jesus stuff right here. This is Vespasian, the Roman emperor, the one who sacked Jerusalem, who sent his son Titus to sack Jerusalem. By the way, Jesus, one of his prophecies was the cursing the fig tree. The fig tree represents the temple of Jerusalem. The fig tree withers, the temple falls. So in a way, Titus is linked to Jesus because he's the one who knocks the temple down. He's almost like an agent for God in that sense, in the Christian sense. But then you go back to Augustus. Augustus was literally called Son of God. D.V. Philly, Son of God. And he was adopted by Julius Caesar. And when he was adopted by Julius Caesar, after they all murdered Caesar in the forum, or in the Senate floor, he avenges his adopted father from the grave with the same name, Julius Caesar. He literally is living as Julius Caesar in the flesh, like he takes on his name, avenges him. All of the conspirators are dead within a year. And everybody was like, whoa, this is the divine Caesar. Ovid, Virgil, all name it, Martial, all these first century writers in Latin are writing about how great Julius Caesar is a god. He is a son of Venus. He ascended into heaven, and his son is the son of God, and he is the greatest of all time. And look at it. And just these are the facts right now. Augustus reigned for like 40 years, and he brought in the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And so
Yeah.
people are looking at this and they're saying, maybe he is divine. This has never been seen before. Ever since
Yeah.
the time of Alexander the Great, no one's been this successful. This is the greatest of all time. And so you got to wonder, the Son of God archetype, when Christianity is being written, when the Gospels are being written about Jesus, and you're creating a Son of God character, you're gonna go to what you know, and that's Augustus, and that's
Yeah.
So Tacitus is doing the same thing with Vespasian. He's
I think there's one thing people don't mention a lot that I think Dr. John Dominic Crossan points out. And I remember in one of the interviews I did with him, he points out there are people that thought Nero was going to return,
I can
and
pull the
that
text
there's
up right now.
false Neros too, just like with Jesus in the book of Revelation, and also I think in the Gospel of Matthew, there'll be many that will come in my name and deceive, and they'll say that they are of Christ and deceive many.
Yeah.
Think about that. Yeah.
So it's okay. I found the text. Sibylline Oracles 4:155 to 159. So let me share my screen. Let me fix my my what's it called real quick.
Your phone?
No, yeah, my camera, and I'm
Okay.
gonna share my screen because this person paid a hefty super chat, so we're gonna stay
Oh yeah, absolutely.
a couple seconds. Let me just fix my camera. By the way, my new camera's coming in this week. I am getting it this week, by the end of this week,
Nice.
actually. So I will be I'm finally getting that really, really nice camera. All right,
Right.
so book 4 of the Sibylline Oracles. By the way, I mentioned in the beginning, so this is so important. We circle back to Alexandria and how it relates to Christians.
Yeah.
Now we're circling back to the Sibylline books. The Sibylline books, if anyone who knows Sibylline books, they go back to the 5th century BCE of Rome, and they're purely pagan texts that have to do with, like, the goddess Venus tells us to do this, or Apollo said to do this. And now it's the Christian God telling people these things. The Christians sort of take over the Sibylline tradition. And so book 4, this is written in the 1st century. And it's 60 something. Let me find it. It's right over here. Oh, Carthage. All right, here it is. Also, for thee, Armenia, there remains a Slavish fate, and there shall also come to Salama an evil blast of war from Italy, and God's great temple spoil. But when these trusting follies shall cast off their piety and murders consummate around the temple, then front Italy a mighty king shall like a runaway slave flee over the Euphrates stream unseen. Now they thought this was Nero because Nero fled to the east. This is what they thought. It's not true. This is what they thought. See, look, mighty king. The person has a entry. It's Nero, and then it says that unknown who shall some dare loathsome guilt of matricide. That means someone who kills their mother. Guess who killed their mother? Nero. Nero killed his mother. And many other things, having confidence in his most wicked hands, and many for the throne with blood, was Rome spoil while he flees over Parthian land. And out of Syria shall comes Rome's foremost man, who having burned the temple of Jerusalem, that's Salima means Jerusalem. That's just a shorter word, Jerusalem. And that's talking about Vespasian now. Having slaughtered many of the Jews, shall destruction on their broad land, and then shoot to an earthquake shall overthrow. Blah 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 blah. Anyways, long story short, I think it's down here more. There's something about him coming back. He's gonna return. I think it's right here actually. Wreath. I don't know. You guys can look this up. You guys know what I'm saying. But anyways, the point is, in the Sibylline texts, these are written in the late 1st century. By the way, the people who wrote this text are the same circle of people who wrote Revelation. It's the same genre. It's written by the same people. Like, I'm not going to say it's the same person that wrote this, but it's the people who wrote that Sibylline oracle. The book of Revelation is basically like a Sibylline oracle.
Yeah, and the Sibylline oracles also talk about that they portray Ares as Nero, as if Ares and Nero are the same person,
Yeah,
and he will return and utterly destroy Rome.
yeah, he would, and
And the oracles talk about,
that's where you get 666 from.
yeah,
The Antichrist, Nero. They're and you guys can look this up. It's all over the internet. People thought until the 5th century they were waiting for Nero to come back to
yeah,
wreak. This was a thing that people thought was going to happen in their lifetime. For centuries, the people kept thinking, "Oh,
right.
Nero's going to come back."
And I want to remind people
Parthia.
the false Neros too. They
Yeah,
talk about there are just people out there pretending to be Nero.
yeah,
Don't
I
listen
heard
to
about
them.
that.
That's
Yeah,
just like the Antichrist.
yeah.
Similar story.
Pseudo Nero. Okay, here it is, right here. I found it.
There you
Yeah,
go.
you're so right. This is such a big thing.
Yeah.
Look at this. Pseudo Nero. After the Emperor Nero committed suicide near the villa of his freedman Phaon in June 68, various Nero impostors appeared between
That's
the
it.
autumn of 69 and the reign of Domitian.
There you go.
Most scholars set the number of Nero impostors to 2 or 3, although St. Augustine wrote the popularity of the belief that Nero would return in his day, known as Nero Redivivus legend.
Redivivus.
Redivivus legend. The
Yeah.
Nero Redivivus legend was a popular belief during the last part of the 1st century, as we just showed you. Sibylline oracles. See, I'm going to read this whole thing real quick. 1st century, that the Roman Emperor Nero would, after his death in 68, the legend was a common belief as late as the 5th century. See, I know what I'm talking about, guys. No, I'm just kidding. No, that was a good guess. That was a good guess. The belief was either the result or cause of several impostors who posed as Nero, leading rebellions. Several variations of the legend exist on both hope and fear of Nero's return. The earliest written version of this legend is found in the Sibylline oracles. And I'm not kidding when I say this. The book of Revelation comes out of that genre. So does the Ascension of Isaiah. So Ascension of Isaiah, Revelation, they're really dreamlike. They're not like, they don't make sense, but they're like, or they're oracles basically. They're like trying to tell the future in a way. That's what they're doing. That's why there's such a that's so weird. It's like Ascension of Isaiah is such a weird text. Revelation is such a weird. That's because this is a genre. It's that genre. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, thank you so much for that super chat. Really interesting topic. And Jacob, anything else you want to say about that?
No, I think we pretty much covered it at the moment.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Paul Kickling, what we know the Hellenic Judaism existed through Philo. Jesus comes from the most Hellenized part of Israel. By the way, when I went to Nazareth, and when I went to the city of right next to Nazareth, the city drawing a blank right now. When I was in the Galilee, I should say that. When I was in the Galilee, Paul Kickling is not lying. It is very Hellenized. The archaeology, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, it's there's Bacchus, there's Orpheus, all that stuff is in Galilee. There's a grotto of Pan. Do you know the god Pan with the horns? It looks like the devil.
I do. I know who that is.
There's a grotto dedicated to Pan in the Galilee. Very Hellenized. Very Hellenized. Anyways, Jesus had to abide to Plato just as much as the Torah. I'll explain in the chat. All right, let's see if we can find your explanation in the chat, Paul. Where are you at? Okay, here we go. Philo was already seeing the Torah with Platonic eyes. And is this true? This is true. And if you notice, the Gospels are kind of a Platonic retelling of the Torah. 40 years in the wilderness. Paul, I like this. I got to admit, I like this. What do you think? What do you think, Jacob? I like this, Paul.
I think that's right. Because it's not just the Christians that are doing this; even the Gnostics, they Platonize Christianity by taking Plato's Demiurge and putting it into a Christianized context.
Yeah, and
Basically reinterpreting the Jewish God through a Platonic lens.
yeah, and you know what? The Septuagint, when the Septuagint was put together during the Ptolemaic Empire, the Greeks now have access to. This was a Greek thing in Alexandria. It became like Philo is a result of this. Philo is a Greek speaking Greek. Really, his Greek is amazing. He can write really nice Greek. He's a scholar of religions. He knows about Bacchus. He knows about Orpheus. He knows about the philosophers. He writes about Diogenes of Sinope. He writes about Socrates. He writes about all these. Philo knows it all. He knows that he's very educated. He's a result of the Septuagint Judaism, of Greek Judaism. And Christianity comes out of this same avenue. So, and
Yep.
obviously Middle Platonism is just, you can't escape it. It's everywhere. You're not you're not
Absolutely.
creating a
Yeah.
new
Yeah.
religion in the first century that's not Middle Platonists. It's just not happening.
Right. Yeah.
Good points. Good points. Thank you, Paul, for that. I appreciate that. Duran Childs, thank you for the super chat. Was Jesus married to Mary Magdalene? The Gospel of Phillips reads, he would kiss on the lips. In the Gospel of John, Jesus visits her after the resurrection. Go
For a
ahead.
long time, I've been convinced of James Tabor and James Charlesworth and Simco Jacobovici's viewpoint that the Talpiot tomb is the family tomb of Jesus. I know there's a lot of controversy about that, but I find their argument to be convincing. So henceforth, I do think Mary Magdalene had a relationship with the historical Jesus. So I would basically agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously something going on with this character, Mary Magdalene, and even after, even like later generations are emphasizing how important Mary Magdalene was. She was just one of the. She's one. Basically, she's like one of the apostles. You know what I mean? She's
Right.
and like, who is this? Why is Jesus so? Why? There's actually a Gospel of Mary that says that Mary Magdalene was the only one who knew the secret inner wisdom of Jesus, that no one else was told
Yeah.
except for her. And they all make fun of her and say, "You're just a woman. What are you?" And Peter got up and said, "If Jesus wanted her to know, he wanted her to know, and you guys should listen to her."
That's it.
That's the Gospel of Mary. It's a good gospel, actually. But
Oh yeah, it's
but
lovely.
yeah, it's just one of those different ones. One of those change it up for Christians are like that friend you have that plays the same record every time you go over to their house. Put something different on for once. Come on, guys. That's how Christians are. But yeah, no, I agree with you, Duran. There's something going on there. Thank you for that super chat. Brave New History. Thanks for the super chat.
Hmm.
What's going on? Any speculation on what Abraxas symbolizes? And I could tell you right away what it is, because I
Yeah, because
read Basilides the Gnostic, and I've also read
mhm,
Hippolytus. So Abraxas, the symbol on my channel, the man, the bird head guy with the man with the soldier body and the snake legs. Okay, his head represents the air because it's a bird, flies. The body is land, and the serpent is the sea. So you have the three major elements. But the name Abraxas in Greek has a gematria, which means the Greek letters add up to the sum of 365, which means he's like a calendar god.
yeah,
365 for the days of the year, years. But there's also 7 letters, which is the 7 planets and 7 days of the week. And then some. And then I've even heard some people point out that the multiplying his consonants and vowels gives you 12 for the zodiac and the months of the year. So he's a time god. But if you take the time god aspect and put it next to the fact that he has the elements, and then he's got a spear and a shield, male and female. He is what he is basically is he's the god that represents reality itself. So he's the they call him the mega archon.
Yeah.
Archon Megas in Greek. He's the mega archon. That's why I like him so much, because it's such a fascinating concept. If you're going to make a god, you might as well make it the reality itself. Why not? Like Basilides was onto something here. If you're just gonna decide out what is God, why not just be reality itself? That's what Abraxas is. Reality itself. You know,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Anyways, thank you for that super chat. There's a couple more. James Valiant is in the house. What's going on, James?
Hey, James.
Philo did not tell us about a dying and rising man god whose human sacrifice will be the new covenant yet. Interesting. You know, because I know what he's getting at. Philo tells us everything that the Christians are borrowing from Philo is so central to Christian religion.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of there being the Logos who inherits the kingdom of heaven from the Father. That's something you can get in Christianity. Except for you don't have this Messiah man human sacrifice thing. It's a good point. But Philo sure as hell is being borrowed by Christians heavily.
I mean,
So
I tend to think Paul probably knew Philo. Probably at least heard of what he thinks.
it's possible.
Yeah.
At least knows who he is. Philo was very
Mm-hmm.
famous. Philo was in the embassy, very very high ranking member of the Roman Empire. Like very, and his nephew. So his nephew was second in line next to Vespasian in the Roman Empire. Julius Alexander. He was right next to Titus when the Jerusalem temple got knocked down. So we're talking people who are very, very much linked to the Roman Empire, who are connected to Philo, connected to this, theology that Christianity comes out of. Not a bad point by Valiant here. Not a bad point at all.
Yeah.
You can't ignore these things. You can't just ignore these things. They're there.
Yep.
Lev Polyakov, thank you for the super chat. Love Yellow Sykes' Roman staff with moon and sun. Reminds me of chakras and same staffs seen in Babylon. What's the lore behind Jesus and Mary Magdalene moving to France? Fairy stream on BTR tomorrow. We both talked to that scholar who talks about the legend of Mary Magdalene moving. I think it's just her, or is it her and Jesus moving to France?
Yeah, I don't buy that at all.
No,
I think
I
this is middle age
Yeah.
stuff, medieval.
But he is pointing to an actual legend, though. It's
I know.
not like someone in 2020, not like someone in 1920 wrote this. Like we're talking like not early.
But some people take this
4th, 5th century text. Yeah.
Some people think this is real, and I'm like, come on.
No, it's not.
No.
If that was the case, I don't know. If that was the case, I just think there would be a lot more to say about that rather than randomly popping up in the middle of the Middle Ages. Like you'd think Paul would know, but then again, Paul doesn't say shit anyway. So it's not impossible. I'm giving it a 1 out of 10 possibility. I'm not giving it a 0. I'm giving it a 1 out of 10 possibility. That's what I'm giving it. But yeah, go find Break the Rules podcast. Thank you, Lev, for that. Appreciate that. Paul Kickling, thank you for this another super chat. Really appreciate you tonight. Getting it wrong of who the Savior is a theme itself within the New Testament, from Mark to Revelations. So Romans, seeing Vespasian and Augustus as saviors, are like Trump cultists for Christians.
That's a very interesting comparison.
That is a good point. That's what it is. It's the same shit you see today.
Yeah.
Everyone always wants to deify their political leader. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Cicero pointed this out. Cicero was very critical of Caesar. He was pointing this out. Like, this guy is he's not good. Like, he's not doing the real Republican traditional, because Cicero was a conservative, and not in the sense that we talk about today, because he was kind of like a metropolitan guy who wanted to, whatever. But Caesar was like this warrior priest, by the way, because he was the high priest. So you have this warrior priest guy, Julius Caesar, against this senator orator, amazing Latin speaker, really eloquent guy, Cicero. That is so. When we think of like Nancy Pelosi versus Trump, they're nothing compared to Cicero and Julius Caesar. Cause it's just different worlds, different time, different worlds.
Right.
It almost seems legendary to think about that battle happening in Rome.
Yeah.
Between those two iconic figures in history happening at the same time. It's pretty. I don't know. I like it. It's mind blowing. Just to think about it, it's kind of crazy. I honestly, I side with Cicero. I think Cicero's on the right side of history. I think Caesar was on the wrong side of history, but might usually wins out, and good ideas don't always win out. And I think Cicero had better ideas.
Very true.
That's just me personally. I like reading Cicero. His book On the Nature of the Gods. It's very I want to say stoic, but it's like very rational. Cicero has a very rationalist approach to religion, where he's like, it's not real, but like there's some like metaphors behind it we can look at. Like that's how Cicero.
You gotta think about how much of a risk he was taking saying this kind of stuff back then.
Yeah, exactly. He was way ahead of his time. Way
absolutely.
Whereas Caesar probably was like, I am the son of Venus, and these gods do exist, and they are real. You better listen. Whereas Cicero's like, come on, dude. What are you talking about? Like, But yeah, read the book. It's called On the Nature of the Gods by Cicero. And he brings this really enlightened approach to religion that you just don't see in that time period at all by anybody. So it's very interesting stuff. But thank you for that super chat. Paul Kickling, thank you for the super chat. Again, I almost read that like it was another person. It's the same person. Thank you. I appreciate it. You guys should look into Blake's Urzian deity. His version of Abraxas is basically, and he was writing 100 years before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi. Wow. Oh, and just before you say anything, the reason why people knew about Abraxas before they found the Nag Hammadi is because of people like Irenaeus and Hippolytus, who wrote about these heresies, quote unquote heresies.
Yeah.
And Abraxas is written about in those texts.
I was just about to mention that, but I think you got that covered already. I got nothing else to say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Abraxas was well known before Nag Hammadi. Just like the Gospel of Judas, people knew that text existed before we found it. It was just confirmation. Now we can actually read the text. People knew those texts. They're documented by the early church fathers. They write about all this stuff. They just didn't preserve it. They tried those little fuckers. They tried to we got them though. We got them.
Yeah.
The biggest mistake that these refutators ever did was try to refute these heresies. But now we have them, and now they're even better than before. Now we just look at everyone loves these texts now, So
yeah,
their attempt to stomp out their heresies ended up backfiring big time, I think, especially right now. But
yeah,
I don't know. I floor is yours, Jacob, on whatever you want to talk about. That's the last super chat.
Honestly, I think I pretty much covered it, and I guess I'll just reiterate the point that we have to be careful that there are a lot of texts that have been modified by copyists. So I guess what I'll say is not everything is as it appears.
Yeah, there's always that chance that, because like I mentioned earlier, we have the textual criticism tells us that the manuscripts line up to a certain degree. But our oldest manuscripts are third century, fourth century, maybe late second for some, maybe one or two texts in the second century. I don't even know if is that the case. Maybe one or two.
There's
and we're talking fragments that are.
Yeah, Bart Ehrman loves to say we got this fragment. I think it's called P52 of the Gospel of John.
It's the credit.
And it looks
It's
like a
size of a
credit
credit card.
card.
Yeah. So even looking at that, we don't even know. Like we're talking 3rd, 4th century text, and they line up. Okay, yeah, they do line up. There's a little bit of differences here and there, but we
Yeah.
don't know. We don't know how much changes there was done. 2 centuries is a long time. Like, just think about it. From 1900
And
to the year, from let's say 1800 to the year 2000, how much changes in the world have gone down from 1800 to 2000?
the scary possibility.
We're talking American Revolution just finished 20 years ago, or it's just finishing now. Actually, 1801 just finished. The Civil War didn't even happen yet. Compared to Y2K, 9/11, the world, that's a different world.
Just throw this in here as my last comment.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to say real quick, the world that Paul's living in compared to the world that we have his documentation of, who knows what was changed between then? Who knows?
Here's a scary possibility. And I don't buy this, but this is throwing it out there. It could be the worst case scenario is it could be almost 100% different.
You never know.
So much that it's not really even the same text anymore. It's just something else.
Yeah, you're like there's always a possibility that in the 2nd century, someone wrote these 7 letters and just
destroyed it and wrote new stuff over it.
Yeah, and just saved a couple of key things that date the text, that anchor the text to that time. There's always that possibility. I'm not a textual critic guy, so I can't say for sure. Yeah. But I'm just saying, I'm just throwing ideas out there. Don't get mad at me.
Right.
It's always possible. But
yeah, thanks for having me on today, Neil.
Yeah, but for sure, before we go, I do have to plug. And History Valley, guys, go and subscribe. It's a great channel. You got Robin Faith Walsh coming on next month, doing big things. You've been on fire, dude. You've been having great guests on.
And I've actually got a lot more live streams than that. I just haven't put them up yet, but they will be.
Yeah.
And the next couple of days, I'm gonna put them up. There's a lot more coming on the channel, and I can't wait to host them.
Yeah, the link's in the description. So seriously, go down there and subscribe. Yep. And with that being said, you have just attained true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The Demiurge has no power over